In March of 1897, a catastrophic fire tore through the county courthouse in Willow Creek, Louisiana. The blaze reduced decades of public history to ash, land deeds, birth records, marriage licenses, entire lives erased in a single night. Clerks and townspeople rushed to salvage whatever they could from the collapsing structure, dragging charred ledgers and scorched files into the open air. Amid the chaos, an unexpected discovery emerged. Behind a false wall in the basement archives, concealed within a sealed iron strongbox, officials found a bundle of letters, 47 in total. Each was written in a child's hand. Every one was addressed to families who had lived in the region between 1848 and 1865. None had ever been mailed. All bore the same return location, Magnolia Ridge Plantation. According to official records, Magnolia Ridge had been abandoned since 1866. The unsettling nature of the find became clear as courthouse clerk Harriet DuPont carefully laid the singed pages out to dry. The letters were not merely written by different children. They were written by children with the same names, names that appeared repeatedly across decades. It was as if the same group of children had been writing again and again, year after year, long past any reasonable lifespan. Questions spread quickly through Willow Creek. Who had hidden these letters so deliberately within the courthouse itself? Why had correspondence continued to originate from a plantation officially listed as deserted for more than 30 years? And most disturbing of all, what had taken place at Magnolia Ridge that someone went to such lengths to erase it from memory? The answers lay buried in a past that had been carefully concealed for generations. The story of Magnolia Ridge Plantation begins in the winter of 1832, when a prosperous Charleston merchant named Victor Langley purchased over 12,000 acres of fertile bottomland along the Pearl River in southern Louisiana. Unlike most plantation owners of his time, Langley had not built his wealth through farming. His fortune came from shipping and trade, with business ties stretching across the South and as far north as Philadelphia. Using these connections, Langley established what he described as an experimental agricultural enterprise, Magnolia Vines. It was known simply as the Children's House. No one from outside Magnolia Ridge was ever allowed inside, and no one who entered ever spoke of what truly happened there. When supply wagons delivered goods to Magnolia Ridge, drivers were instructed to leave children's provisions, clothing, books, paper, medicine at the gate. The items would be collected after the wagons departed. Even the plantation doctor, a man named Thomas Garrett, who treated both enslaved workers and white overseers for illnesses and injuries, was never called to the Children's House. "If a child takes ill, we manage it ourselves," Langley told him once with a smile that Garrett later described as pleasant but final. There was something else too, something that should have raised more questions but somehow didn't at the time. The children never left. According to the records Langley submitted to the parish each year, children were regularly placed with families or apprenticed to craftsmen in surrounding counties. The paperwork was meticulous. Names, dates, destinations, everything looked legitimate. But no one in Willow Creek or the neighboring towns could remember actually seeing children from Magnolia Ridge being taken away to new homes. No one recalled families arriving to collect them. It was as if they simply vanished into the Children's House and then on paper reappeared somewhere else entirely. In 1842, a woman named Dorothy Hinton traveled from Natchez to Magnolia Ridge. Her younger sister, a girl named Emma, had been sent to the plantation 2 years earlier from a Natchez orphanage after their mother died of fever. Dorothy had saved money from working as a seamstress and wanted to visit Emma, perhaps even take her back to Natchez if Langley would permit it. She was turned away at the main gate. Langley met her personally, dressed in an impeccable grey suit, his manner cordial but immovable. He explained that Emma had already been placed with a family in Baton Rouge, a kind couple who owned a dry goods store and needed help minding their younger children. He showed Dorothy a document with official-looking seals. He even offered to write to the family on her behalf. Dorothy accepted the letter and returned to Natchez reassured. But 3 months later, when she received no reply, she wrote directly to the parish clerk in Baton Rouge, asking for information about any dry goods stores that might employ a girl named Emma Hinton. The clerk responded that no such business existed and no family by the name Langley had provided could be found in the parish records. Dorothy wrote to Langley demanding answers. She received no response. She wrote to the sheriff of Willow Creek. Her letter was filed but never investigated. Years later, in the documents discovered after the courthouse fire, investigators found Dorothy's original complaint stamped with a single notation in faded ink: "Matter resolved, petitioner satisfied." There was no record of any resolution and no evidence Dorothy Hinton had ever written again. Now, here's what you need to understand about Magnolia Ridge to appreciate what came next. The plantation wasn't isolated. It stood along a relatively well-traveled road between Willow Creek and the river docks. People passed by it regularly: merchants, travelers, riverboat workers, and yet for nearly 2 decades no one truly questioned what happened behind at Magnolia covered fence. Part of the reason was Langley himself. He was careful. He contributed generously to local churches, sponsored community events, and made friends with influential men. He never drew attention to the Children's House. He simply ran his plantation, paid his debts, and maintained the appearance of a benevolent, if private, gentleman. But there was another reason, darker and more human. People saw what they wanted to see. They preferred the story of the generous merchant saving orphans to the uncomfortable questions that might have followed if they looked closer. That willful blindness would haunt the region for generations. Now, if you're wondering how all of this connects to the letters found in 1897, the ones written by children decades after they should have grown up, we need to move forward to the year 1861. The Civil War changed everything in Louisiana as it did across the South. Cotton prices collapsed, trade routes were severed, plantations that had thrived for decades found themselves struggling to survive. Magnolia Ridge was no exception. Victor Langley, now in his 62nds, continued to operate the plantation, though on a much smaller scale. Fewer wagons arrived with goods, fewer workers remained on the land. But curiously, the wagons carrying children still came. Even in 1863, at the height of the war, when Union forces controlled New Orleans and supplies were scarce throughout the Confederacy, records show that at least 3 transports of children arrived at Magnolia Ridge from an orphanage in Mobile. Why would an orphanage in a city under siege send children hundreds of miles to a failing plantation in the middle of a war? That question had become central to the investigation. Decades later, in April of 1865, just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Victor Langley died. The official cause, recorded by a traveling physician who happened to be passing through Willow Creek, was listed as apoplexy, what we would now call a stroke. He was found in his study, slumped over his desk, a pen still in his hand. The plantation passed to his nephew, a man named Marcus Langley, who lived in Mobile and had visited Magnolia Ridge only a handful of times. Marcus arrived in May of 1865 to survey his inheritance. What he found troubled him deeply, though the exact nature of his concerns wouldn't become clear until much later. He stayed at the plantation for exactly 6 days. During that time, according to testimony later given by one of the remaining overseers, Marcus spent hours in the Children's House, examining records, speaking with the caretakers, and walking the grounds with a look of visible distress. On the 6th day, he locked the Children's House, dismissed all remaining staff with severance pay, and left Magnolia Ridge. He never returned. In June of 1866, Marcus Langley sold the entire property, buildings, land, equipment to a timber company based in Baton Rouge for a price far below market value. The sale contract included one unusual stipulation: the Children's House and the acre of land surrounding it were to be left untouched. The building was to remain locked, and no one was to enter it for any reason. The timber company agreed. It was a strange request, but the land was valuable enough that they didn't argue. For the next 30 years, Magnolia Ridge Plantation ceased to exist as a working property. The fields grew wild. The main house slowly deteriorated. Timber crews cut down trees on the western sections of the land, but avoided the eastern edge where the Children's House stood, now barely visible behind decades of unchecked magnolia growth. And there the story might have ended, lost to time and overgrowth, if not for the fire in 1897. When Harriet Dupont, the courthouse clerk, first examined the letters found in the iron box, she assumed they were simply old correspondence that had been misfiled. But as she read them, the strangeness began to reveal itself. The first letter was dated July 14, 1848. It was written in a careful childish hand on thin yellowed paper. The letter read, "Dear Mama, I am at the plantation now. Mr. Langley says I will learn many things here and that you should not worry. The house is big and there are other children. We have lessons every day. I miss you. Please write to me, your daughter Sarah." Simple, heartbreaking in its innocence, but nothing particularly unusual. The second letter was also from a Sarah, dated November 3rd, 1852. "Dear Aunt Margaret, I have been here 4 months now. Mr. Langley says I am progressing well in my studies. There are 15 of us in the house. We are not allowed outside the fence, but we have a garden. I would like to see you again. Please come visit your niece, Sarah." Harriet noticed the surname. Both Sarah had written Sarah Colby. The third letter, dated March 19, 1859, was also signed Sarah Colby. "Dear Father, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I have been studying mathematics and natural philosophy. Mr. Langley says I show great aptitude. I do not understand why I cannot receive letters from you. I am told the postal routes are unreliable. I remain your loving daughter, Sarah." Harriet laid the 3 letters side by side. The handwriting was different, clearly written by different people. The circumstances described were different, but the name was the same, and the tone of each letter held the same unsettling quality: polite, educated, completely unaware that anything was wrong. As Harriet continued through the letters, the pattern became undeniable. There were multiple letters signed by children named Thomas Reed spanning 1850 to 1864, several from a Mary Brennan written between 1853 and 1862, 4 from a boy named William Cross, dated across a 9-year period. Either the same children had been writing for impossibly long stretches of their childhoods without ever aging beyond 12 or 13, or the more disturbing possibility, different children were being given the same identities one after another, writing letters to families who had no idea their own children had been replaced. Harriet Dupont brought the letters to the attention of the parish sheriff, a man named Louis Daru, Devo, nearing retirement and accustomed to routine property disputes and minor thefts, initially dismissed the discovery as a clerical oddity. But Harriet was persistent. She compiled the letters by name and date, creating a chronological record that was impossible to ignore. Reluctantly, Sheriff Darrow agreed to investigate. His first step was to track down Marcus Langley, who had inherited the plantation and sold it in 1866. Marcus was now 71 years old, living in a modest home in Mobile. When Devo's deputy contacted him by telegram, requesting information about the children's house at Magnolia Ridge, DGE, Marcus responded immediately. His telegram was brief. "Do not open that building, burn it to the ground. Some truths are better left buried." Naturally, this did the opposite of discouraging investigation. It confirmed that something deeply wrong had occurred at Magnolia Ridge, and that Marcus Langley knew exactly what it was. Sheriff Devo organized a party of 6 men, himself, 2 deputies, the parish clerk, a local physician named Dr. Raymond Fisher, and a journalist from the Willow Creek Gazette named Jonathan Webb. On a gray morning, in April 1897, they rode out to the remains of Magnolia Ridge Plantation. What they found there would change how the entire region understood its own history. The children's house stood exactly where the old property maps indicated, though it was nearly invisible beneath 30 years of overgrowth. Magnolia vines had completely engulfed the structure, climbing over the roof and walls, creating a living shroud. The fence that had once surrounded it had collapsed in places, swallowed by vegetation. The building itself was constructed of brick and cypress wood built to last. A single-story, perhaps 80 feet long and 30 feet deep, with a row of narrow windows along each side. All the windows were shuttered from the inside. The front door was secured with a heavy iron padlock, rusted but still intact. Sheriff Darrow broke it open with a pry bar. The smell that emerged when the door swung open was overwhelming, not of decay, but of mustiness, of air that had been sealed away for decades. Dust hung thick in the shaft of light that cut through the doorway. The men hesitated, then stepped inside. What they saw stopped them cold. the interior of the children. N's house was a single long room divided by wooden partitions into smaller sections. But it wasn't the architecture that shocked them. It was the fact that everything, furniture, papers, personal belongings, had been left exactly as it was the day the building was locked. There were rows of small wooden beds, each with a neatly folded blanket. Shelves lined the walls filled with books, slates, and writing materials. A long table ran down the center of the room, set with tin cups and plates as if waiting for a meal that never came. Children's clothing hung on pegs. Shoes were lined up beneath the beds, arranged by size. It looked like a schoolroom or perhaps a dormitory, orderly, almost peaceful. But the details told a different story. Dr. Fisher, examining the room carefully, noted that the windows were not just shuttered. They were nailed shut from the outside. The door had been the only way in or out, and there were no personal items, no dolls, no toys, no letters from family. Nothing that suggested these children had any connection to a life beyond these walls. Jonathan Webb, the journalist, moved to the far end of the room where a heavy wooden cabinet stood against the wall. He opened it and found what would become the most important discovery of the investigation. A complete record system meticulously maintained, documenting every child who had passed through Magnolia Ridge from 1834 to 1865. The ledgers were organized by year. Each entry included a child's original name, age at arrival, physical description, and origin, but beside many entries was a second notation, written in a different hand reassigned, and next to that, a new name, Emma Hinton. The girl whose Sister Dorothy had come searching for in 1842 was listed as arriving in June of 1840, age 8, from Natchez Orphan Asylum. Beside her name, reassigned Sarah Colby, June 1840. The Sarah Colby, who had originally arrived in 1835, a different child entirely, was marked with a single word in the margin, graduated. The investigators stood in silence, piecing together what the ledgers revealed. Children arrived at Magnolia Ridge with their own names and identities. Those identities were then stripped away and replaced. A child who arrived as Emma became Sarah. Another who arrived as Ruth became Mary, and when a child graduated, a term that appeared again and again in the records, they were replaced by a new child who assumed their identity. It was a system of serial replacement operating continuously for over 30 years. But the most disturbing question remained unanswered. What did graduated mean? Where did those children go? The ledgers provided no explanation. The last entry in the final volume was dated March 1865, listing a boy named Peter who had arrived from a mobile orphanage. Beside his name reassigned Thomas Reed, and then in the margin a notation that appeared nowhere else in the records. Final rotation program concluding. Sheriff Dero ordered the rest of the building searched thoroughly. In a smaller room behind the main hall, they found additional documents, lesson plans, daily schedules, dietary records, and medical logs. Everything was detailed and methodical, as if the children's house operated with the precision of a military institution. The medical logs were particularly revealing. They documented regular physical examinations of each child, tracking height, weight, vision, and general health. But they also included notations that seemed strange and out of place. Subject displays optimal learning retention, growth rate within expected parameters, behavioral conditioning effective. The language was clinical, detached. It didn't describe children, it described specimens. Dr. Pfizer, reading through the logs with growing horror, made an observation that would reframe the entire investigation. He pointed to a set of medical entries from 1856 documenting a girl named Mary Brennan, one of the names from the courthouse letters. The logs tracked her health meticulously for 8 years, from age 7 to 15, but the letters signed by Mary Brennan, discovered in the courthouse, were all written in the handwriting of a child no older than 10 or 11. If the same Mary had been writing those letters across 8 years, her handwriting should have matured. It should have shown the development of an adolescent and a young woman. It didn't. Every letter was written in the same childish script. The conclusion was inescapable. The Mary Brennan who wrote in 1856 was not the same Mary Brennan who wrote in 1862. Just as the ledgers indicated, when one child graduated, another arrived to take her place and her name. But why? What possible reason could there be for such an elaborate deception? Jonathan Webb found the answer in a locked drawer of a desk in what appeared to be an office area. Inside were contracts, legal agreements between Victor Langley and various institutions across the South: orphanages, poorhouses, charitable societies. The contracts were all variations of the same arrangement. The institutions would provide children to Magnolia Ridge for education, and agricultural training. In exchange, Langley would pay a quarterly fee to each institution. But there was a second set of contracts hidden beneath the first. These were between Langley and wealthy families in Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, and New Orleans. The agreements were written in deliberately vague language, but the intent was clear. Langley would provide these families with educated and conditioned servants at regular intervals, young people who had been prepared for household service through comprehensive training. The families paid substantial sums for this service. The contract specified that the servants provided would be between ages 14 and 16, literate, obedient, and without family connections or legal encumbrances. Magnolia Ridge. The crimes remained the same. The victims remained dead. The additional detail was simply another layer of tragedy on an already tragic story, but it did answer one final question that had lingered since the original investigation. The letters found sealed in the courthouse wall, the ones that had started the entire investigation, had been hidden there by Ruth Nolan herself, a Claire who had worked at the courthouse in the 1880s before the fire came forward after reading Alice Porter's thesis. He remembered Ruth, who had briefly worked as a cleaning woman at the courthouse in 1881. She had access to the building, including the basement archives. She must have placed the iron box behind the false wall during that time, ensuring the letters would eventually be found, even if she couldn't bring herself to expose the truth directly while she was alive. It was her way of confessing without facing the consequences. A coward's confessie, perhaps, but a confession nonetheless. The courthouse fire in 1897 had been accidental, but it had accomplished what Ruth Nolan had hoped for. It forced the truth into the open 16 years after she had hidden the evidence and 7 years after her own death in 1890. Today, the land that was once Magnolia Ridge Plantation is part of a state wildlife preserve. The swamps have reclaimed almost everything. Hikers occasionally visit the area unaware of what lies beneath the cypress and water. The monument to the 23 children still stands in Willow Creek Cemetery, though it's weathered now, the inscription difficult to read. A historical marker was placed near the site of the former plantation in 1976, describing the basic facts of the scandal in carefully neutral language. But the full story, the ledgers, the contracts, the letters, Ruth Nolan's testimony, Marcus Langley's confession, exists only in archives. Academic papers reference it. Occasionally, a documentary filmmaker or podcast host discovers it and brings it to public attention again briefly before it fades back into the background of history. The children themselves remain mostly nameless. Some of their original identities were recovered from orphanage records and cross-referenced with the Magnolia Ridge ledgers, but many of the institutions involved had destroyed or lost their own documentation. For dozens of children, there is no record of who they were before they arrived at the plantation. And the ones who were sold through the program, who lived out their lives under false identities in households across the South, are impossible to trace. They're buried under names that were never truly theirs. Their real selves erased as completely as if they had never existed. There is, however, one strange footnote to the story that emerged in the 1970s, during the construction of a highway expansion near the old plantation site. Construction crews excavating through swampland to lay foundation for a bridge discovered fragments of children's belongings scattered across a wide area of the marsh. Pieces of clothing, a few buttons, a rusted tin cup, a child's shoe. The items were dated by archaeologists to the 1860s, consistent with the timeline of Ruth Nolan's smuggling operation. But they also found something else. Carved into the bark of an ancient cypress tree, preserved beneath layers of overgrowth, were names, dozens of them, first names only, scratched into the wood in childish lettering: Emma, Ruth, Peter, James, Catherine, William, Sarah. Some matched names from the Magnolia Ridge ledgers, others didn't appear in any records at all. It's impossible to know who carved them or when or why. Maybe it was the children Ruth claimed to have saved, marking their presence before they disappeared into the swamp. Maybe it was children from the program during brief moments outside the children's house, claiming some small piece of identity by carving their real names where they thought no one would see. Or maybe the interpretation favored by the archaeologist who documented the find. It was a memorial. Children who knew they would be forgotten, leaving the only trace of themselves they could. The tree was cut down during the highway construction. A section of the trunk with the carved name still visible was preserved and is now housed in the Louisiana State Museum in Baton Rouge. It's displayed in a small exhibit on child welfare history, rarely visited, easy to overlook among the larger narratives of Louisiana's past. But the names are still there, carved deep enough that time and rot couldn't erase them, and in a sense, that's the legacy of Magnolia Ridge. Not the scandal, not the investigation, not even the graves in the swamp, but the stubborn persistence of those names refusing to be forgotten, even when everything else, identities, families, futures, had been stripped away. The children of Magnolia Ridge were hidden for generations. Their suffering was concealed behind pleasant lies and bureaucratic efficiency. But the truth, like those carved names, had a way of surviving. It waited in sealed iron boxes and hidden journals. It rested in mass graves and chalk maps on cellar walls. And eventually, when fire and curiosity and the passage of time aligned, it surfaced. Not to bring justice. Justice was impossible for crimes so old and perpetrators so long dead, but to bear witness, to say that it happened, that it mattered, and that the children who passed through those gates and into that magnolia-shrouded building were real. Their names were taken, but they are not forgotten. If you've made it this far into this story, take a moment to like this video. These historical investigations take weeks of research to bring to you, and your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The question that haunts historians who study the Magnolia Ridge case isn't really about what happened. The documents make that clear enough. The question is, how many other places like it existed? Victor Langley wasn't an anomaly. He was simply one man who created a cyst to exploit a vulnerability that existed throughout the 19th century. The vulnerability of children without families, without advocates, without anyone to notice when they disappeared. Orphanages and poor houses operated with minimal oversight. Children were routinely placed out or apprenticed to adults, with little investigation into whether those placements were legitimate. If a child vanished from an institution's records, there was rarely anyone to ask why. And if someone did ask, a forged document or a plausible lie was often enough to satisfy them. How many other Victor Langleys were operating in the shadows of the 1800s? How many other programs hidden behind charitable facades treated children as resources to be processed and sold? The Magnolia Ridge documents provide a rare window into one such operation, preserved by accident and discovered by chance. But the very fact that it remained hidden for so long, protected by locked doors, sealed boxes, and people's reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths, suggests that other stories remain buried still. In parish records across Louisiana, researchers have since found hints of similar patterns: orphanages with unusually high placement rates and no follow-up documentation, charitable institutions funded by wealthy donors whose business records show payments for household staff acquisition, property transfers with strange stipulations about buildings that must remain locked or land that must stay undisturbed. None as thoroughly documented as Magnolia Ridge. None that led to mass graves or revealed such a methodical system, but enough to suggest that Langley's program wasn't unique, just uniquely well documented. That's orphanage. Reassigned as Mary Brennan 2 weeks after arrival, the girl who had been stripped of her identity, trained and conditioned for 8 years, and then killed when she became an inconvenience, had been buried with the only proof of her real self that she had somehow managed to keep hidden. A locket with her true name and a photograph of the mother she had been taken from. How she had kept it secret through 8 years of the program, through inspections, through the stripping away of personal belongings, through the systematic erasure of her past is unknown. But she had, and when she died, Someone, perhaps Ruth Nolan, perhaps even Victor Langley, in a moment of unexpected humanity, had buried it with her. Sheriff Devo tried to locate Catherine's family in Charleston, hoping to at least inform them of what had happened to her. But the trail was cold. The orphanage had closed in 1871. Its records had been lost. The Hayes family, if they still existed, couldn't be found. Catherine Elizabeth Hayes, like so many of the children of Magnolia Ridge, remained lost, except for that locket and the photograph inside it and the name engraved on the back. Small pieces of proof that she had been real, that she had been loved, and that she had fought in her own quiet way to remember who she was. The locket is now part of the collection at the Louisiana Historical Association, stored in a climate-controlled archive in New Orleans. It's been photographed, documented, and occasionally displayed in exhibits about child welfare history in America, and sometimes researchers who come across it in the archives pause and think about the girl who wore it. About the moment when her mother clasped it around her neck, never imagining it would become the only thing to survive her daughter's stolen life, about the strength it must have taken to hide it year after year through everything the program demanded. It's a small object, a piece of tarnished silver and a faded photograph, but in the story of Magnolia Ridge, where so much was destroyed and so many were forgotten, it stands as a testament to something that couldn't be completely erased. Identity, memory, the stubborn insistence, even in the face of systematic erasure, that we are who we are, not what someone else decides we should be. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's hidden history. The final question, the one that people still ask when they encounter this story, is whether anything like Magnolia Ridge could happen today. The answer is both comforting and unsettling. The specific mechanisms that allowed Victor Langley's program to operate, the lack of oversight on orphanages, the absence of mandatory record-keeping, the legal ambiguity around child placement have been largely eliminated in modern America. Child welfare systems, for all their flaws, have safeguards that didn't exist in the 19th century. But the underlying vulnerability that Langley exploited remains. Children without advocates, without people who will notice if they vanish, without voices that will be heard if they cry for help, still exist. The systems have changed, but the fundamental truth hasn't. When society decides certain people don't matter, when institutions prioritize convenience over conscience, when good people choose not to ask uncomfortable questions, things become possible. Magnolia Ridge wasn't an aberration. It was an inevitability in a system that treated the vulnerable as disposable, and the documents that finally surfaced, the letters, the ledgers, the journals, the contracts, they didn't just reveal what happened at one plantation in Louisiana between 1834 and 1865. They revealed what happens anywhere, anytime. People in power decide that some lives are worth less than others. That's the real horror of this story, not ghosts or curses or supernatural evil, just human choices made systematically, justified carefully, and hidden successfully until fire and time and a clerk's curiosity brought them into the light. The children of Magnolia Ridge deserved better than the lives they were given and the deaths they suffered. They deserved to grow up with their real names, to be remembered by people who loved them, to leave traces in the world beyond carved bark and sealed letters. We can't give them that now. All we can do is tell their story, speak their names when we know them, and remember that they were real. That has to be enough, because the truth, once it surfaces, demands to be acknowledged. Even if it's a century late, even if justice is impossible, even if all we can offer is memory, the plantation is gone, the children are gone, but the documents remain preserved in archives, accessible to anyone willing to look. As long as the records endure, the children of Magnolia Ridge have not vanished entirely. Their names, their fragments of lives, still exist. Their story survived. If this account moved you, share it. Let others know what was hidden for so long, and join us again as we uncover another forgotten chapter of American history. The final known mention of Magnolia Ridge Plantation appeared in a brief newspaper notice in 1982 when the Louisiana State Historical Society installed a small marker at what had become a wildlife preserve. The dedication was modest, A handful of historians stood beside a few local officials, one descendant of Sheriff Deu, and a single elderly woman. After the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, the woman approached the marker alone. She paused there in silence for a long moment, then gently placed a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base and walked away without a word. A photographer from the local paper captured the scene. She was never identified. Years later, researchers studying the photograph noticed a detail easily missed at first glance. The woman appeared to be holding a folded piece of paper just visible at the edge of the frame. Writing could be seen on it, though the text was far too small to read. Some believed it may have been a letter. Who she was and why she came remains unknown. She may have been connected to Magnolia Ridge, perhaps a descendant of the children Ruth Nolan once tried to save, or one of the survivors who lived under an assumed identity. If so, she never came forward. The flowers eventually wilted and were removed, and the moment passed into quiet obscurity. Her presence became yet another unanswered question in a history already filled with them. But perhaps that is fitting. The story of Magnolia Ridge has always been one of hidden children, buried truths, and fragile traces that survived against overwhelming odds. If one final secret remains, one connection that never fully reveals itself, that too may simply be the nature of history. We uncover what we can, we preserve what remains, we tell the stories supported by the evidence we find, and we accept that some truths, some relationships, some final pieces of understanding will forever remain just beyond our reach, visible only in shadows, implications, and silence. The plantation that concealed generations of stolen children is gone now, reclaimed by the swamp that once watched over its darkest acts. But the documents surfaced, the truth emerged, and the children who were taken, silenced, and nearly erased are remembered. Not completely, not perfectly, but remembered. And after everything that was stolen from them, perhaps that small act of remembrance is the only justice that can still be given.